Hello everybody and welcome to the first video in our series of videos on Northern Ireland from 1920 up until 1998. Today we will be looking at how the Northern Ireland Parliament was established and the form of government in the first 20 years of that Parliament. As always, we begin with our learning outcomes. By the end of this presentation, you should know how the Unionists set up a Northern Ireland government. Second, you guys should know 3 ways they dealt with the Unrest in the early 1920s. And third, you guys should know 3 ways Catholics were discriminated against in the newly formed Northern Ireland Parliament. We have been dealing with Northern Ireland since the beginning of our videos on Irish history. It really kicked off with the Home Rule crisis of 1912. In this, remember, we saw the Unionists against Nationalists. The UVF was established in Northern Ireland. The Solemn League and Covenant was signed again with their opposition to Home Rule. Then there was the outbreak of World War I, where a lot of the UVF and the Irish volunteers went to join the British in the war. Then there was the 1916 Rising, which led to the growth of nationalism within the Irish country, where people began to want more than just home rule. This then led to the War of Independence in 1919 up to 1921. We then looked at the Government of Ireland Act, which was brought in 1920, which partitioned the island of Ireland. And now we're going to look at what happened after that. So just to refresh your memory, the Government of Ireland Act was passed in 1920. This partitioned Ireland into the 26 counties and the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, which were Antrim, Armagh, Tyrone, Fermanagh, Down and Derry. Those in the south, they refused to recognise the Government of Ireland Act, or the Fourth Home Rule Bill, and continued on with the Dáil, which remember met in 1919 under the leadership of Eamon de Valera. However, in the north, the Unionists took this opportunity to form their own government and break away from the violence of the south of Ireland. The population division of Northern Ireland at the time was about 65% of the population was Protestant and 35% of the 6 counties was Catholic. The 2 main leaders of the Unionists, as we saw in the Home Rule crisis, were James Craig and Edward Carson. James Craig served as the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, and he served as Prime Minister from 1920 all the way up until 1940. However, Edward Carson felt that only taking the 6 counties was a bit of a betrayal to the other Unionists in the country and retired from politics. Remember, Carson was a Dublin man and he was a Southern Unionist, and he was unhappy about the people who in the other 26 counties who wanted to be part of the Union being excluded. So when they were establishing the Parliament in Northern Ireland, which is situated in Stormont, the Unionists, they dominated the political life. There was a nationalist party, but it pursued a policy of abstention. Remember, that is not taking your seats in Parliament. They kept this policy up until around 1926, when they finally took seats under their leader Joe Devlin, but they were never really big enough to cause any kind of threat to the power of the Unionist Party. Sinn Féin was also banned from Northern Ireland, so that that party was not a route for nationalists in Northern Ireland. When the Government of Ireland Act came in, remember, the War of Independence was raging, which was soon followed by the Civil War in Ireland, and this led to a lot of unrest and violence in Northern Ireland. The IRA were determined to oppose the partition of Ireland, and there was large-scale violence in the north. Over 600 people were killed, with the majority of them being Catholic nationalists. So how did the government deal with this violence, this threat to its existence? In 1922, the government established the Royal Ulster Constabulary, or the RUC. This replaced the RIC, which was the Royal Irish Constabulary. And while a lot of the members of the old IRC had been Catholic. The new IRC was primarily Protestant. It was an armed police force. This is going to become a big issue when we get to the Troubles in the 60s. They also set up the B Specials, which was a part-time police force, and this was mainly made up of the former UVF members. Remember, they would have a very strong unionist affiliation. And finally, they passed the Special Powers Act of 1922. By Special Powers Act, I do not mean that they gave people special powers. I mean that they gave themselves the power to intern people. Remember, internment is imprisoning someone without trial. Anyone who was a suspected to be part of the IRA. The Catholics really suffered a lot of discrimination in this time. Some Catholics were run out of their jobs in Harland and Wolff during the unrest in the 20s. As the government really established itself, it fired a lot of Catholics from the civil service. Both Catholic and Protestant religions wanted to set up their own individual schools. The Catholic schools were given less help by the government, less funding to make sure there was good standards in buildings and in resources that were needed for schools, whereas the Protestant schools were better looked after. One of the big issues as well was gerrymandering. So this is when boundaries of constituencies are rigged, and this was especially prominent in Derry. Derry had a majority population of Derry was Catholic. However, the majority of the seats within Derry went to Unionists because they rigged the boundaries so that most of the seats would go to Protestants or Unionists. In 1929, remember, the Wall Street crash happened, and while Northern Ireland had been the most prosperous part of the country, remember, one of the things why they didn't want Home Rule was because they were the more industrialised, more prosperous part, but the Wall Street crash hit them hard. The linen industry, which had been a big employer, and the shipbuilding industries of Harland and Wolff took massive hits. Unemployment skyrocketed, and poverty in the country became a massive issue. There was a rise in cases of TB, death by pneumonia, people really struggling to survive. And another aspect of life at this time was sectarian violence. This may be a phrase you guys have heard before, but sectarian violence is violence that erupts between conflicting groups or sects. So this was violence between the Protestants and the Catholics. There was a particularly bad case in Belfast in 1935 when the Orange Order marched through Catholic neighbourhoods in Belfast, causing riots. Remember, the Orange Order, they would have been re-established during opposition to the very first Home Rule under Gladstone back in 1885, and they would be marching to celebrate victories over Catholics from hundreds of years ago, which really would inflame situations. That brings us to the end of our presentation. So by now you guys should know how the Unionists set up Northern Ireland. You guys should know 3 ways they dealt with unrest in the early 20s, the setting up of the RUC, the B Specials and the Special Powers Act. And you guys should know 3 ways that Catholics were discriminated against. So whether that was through gerrymandering, through discrimination in employment, or whether it was through discrimination in funding for education. That's the end of the presentation. Hope you guys got something good from this video.